you believe that in the deep forest there are only bears, wolves, and silence? In the vast, silent wilderness of Wyoming, a man left behind the noise of the city and his past, to live alone among the trees. One day, he placed a single red apple on a line of stones in the forest. The next morning, it was gone. Not eaten, replaced with a silver-gray hair and a small stone bead. This is not a tale of monsters, but of something older, smarter, capable of memory and mercy. What if Bigfoot isn't a myth? What if it's a family, just trying to be left alone? This story comes from Ridge Hollis, a man who learned to listen to the silence and, in return, was trusted with a secret no one else was meant to find. A secret now shared with you. And now, dear listener, may I ask, where are you watching from? What's your name, and how far could this story travel if you chose to share it? If you felt even a flicker of wonder or warmth, consider leaving a like, subscribing, and joining a community that believes Bigfoot isn't just real, but worth protecting from the heart of the wild. Thank you for being here. The forest had gone still in that way it only does when something bigger than wind or weather has passed through. Ridge Hollis stood at the edge of a clearing that didn't feel like it belonged to him, or any other man. The pine air tasted sharp. His boots crunched softly on a bed of old needles, and for the first time since leaving Denver, he paused with his full weight off one leg, ears straining toward the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was watching. He didn't say a word, just adjusted the leather strap across his chest, the pack tugging slightly at his shoulders, and kept walking into the deeper shade where the trail began to vanish. No birds, no breeze. Just the sound of his own slow breathing and the occasional pop of sun through the trees like flashes on a dark screen. The Bridger Range had always been like a church to Ridge. Wild, vast, unclaimed. He came for the solitude, for the sharp edges of quiet that cut through the noise that used to live in his bones. After his mother passed, slowly, painfully, he didn't just move to the edge of the map. He erased himself from it. He found an old surveyor's route that cut through the lesser-marked corners of the Wind River Range, places not even the rangers spoke of much anymore, places that didn't show up right on paper maps, and certainly not on the kind tourists picked up in gas stations. He hadn't come to chase myths, just to breathe. But that morning, about 5 miles past the last dry creek bed, the trail changed. Something about the growth. Saplings had been snapped, not broken by wind or careless boots. No, these were deliberate, angled, fresh. He stopped. 3 thin pines, bent just enough to resemble an arrow pointing uphill. The breaks were too clean, the placement too exact. His carpenter's eye caught it instantly. This was no accident. Someone or something had left a sign. Not a marker for people. A message for others like it. His mouth went dry. Ridge had seen a lot of wilderness tricks in his time, but this didn't look like bushcraft or wayfinding. It looked like language. He moved slow from then on. Steadier breath, measured steps. Not for fear. He didn't feel hunted, but for respect. Whatever was out here, it had rules. He was no longer just a visitor. He was trespassing. The dirt darkened near a shallow stream. The late sun threw long gold streaks across the water, but it wasn't the light that stopped him. It was the footprint. He crouched, not breathing. The mud still held shape. Toes, 5 of them. Wide ball, heavy heel. At least 17 inches long and deep, like it had been pressed by something weighty but soft, without a defined sole like a boot. Ridge had never seen a print that big, that human, and not human. He didn't photograph it, didn't sketch it, just stood slowly, eyes moving to the trees. Nothing moved, but that feeling, the one like he was walking across someone's porch without knocking, crept in again. He should have turned back, but his feet moved forward. About an hour past the stream, the terrain began to pinch. The path narrowed into a natural funnel between 2 low ridges. Fog had started to roll down, soft and strange, though the air wasn't cold. Ridge knew fog. He didn't trust it. Not here. Not when it came too fast and too quiet. By the time he reached the edge of the box canyon, visibility had dropped to 20 feet. The sky above was still pale blue. But down here, it might as well have been midnight. Then something caught his eye. Up high, maybe 15 feet above the canyon floor. A stack of flat rocks, tucked into a split pine, balanced with intention. Ridge walked under it, slow, careful not to shift the air. Above that, lashed branches twisted in a pattern he couldn't decode. Not a nest, not a hunter's blind, a watchpost. Whoever, or whatever, built it didn't mean to hide. It meant to see. Then he saw it. A figure, rough, waist-high, carved from dark wood. Standing just off trail, shoulders hunched, arms down. One open hand placed flat against its chest. Not threatening, not a warning, just there. Like a statue meant to speak to the right kind of eyes. Ridge swallowed. Something inside him, a carpenter's instinct, maybe something older, understood. It wasn't a scarecrow. It was a signpost, a boundary marker. He stepped closer. Just beyond the statue, the ground changed again. Rocks, small, flat, clean. Lined up in a razor-straight row across the earth like someone had dragged a ruler across the wild. Not a trail. Not a cairn, a line. Every stone spaced with the kind of precision only human minds or their equal could conceive. But it wasn't human. He stood before it, unsure what to do. Every cell in his body told him this line was not to be crossed without permission. He reached into his coat pocket. An apple. Crimson red. He'd brought it for the hike, but hadn't touched it. He bent down and placed it gently at the head of the stone line. A gift, an apology, a gesture. The fog thickened. Ridge didn't move. Then he turned slowly. Made no sound. Began walking back the way he came. But 5 steps later, something made him stop cold. Another footprint. This one newer. Slightly smaller. Layered perfectly over the faint mark his own boot had left just minutes earlier. Which meant it had been behind him. Long enough to watch. Long enough to wait. He didn't run. He didn't shout. Just stood there, heart drumming. A single crow called in the distance. And somewhere above the fog, the sky began to shift color. Gold to gray. That night, back at the secondary cabin he'd repaired last spring near the outer boundary of Mabel's old pasture land, Ridge sat with the fire low and the door bolted. Not out of fear, out of reverence. He said nothing, but in the dark, he whispered once to no one. "I'm sorry," he said, voice low, raw. "I didn't know it was your home." Morning came in pale amber strokes across the clearing. The dew clung to every needle and blade. Ridge rose early, unsure what he expected. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. He walked back up toward the canyon, this time slower. Not to invade, just to see. The apple was gone. In its place, right where he'd laid it, was something else. A tuft of silver-gray hair, soft as smoke, coiled next to a single stone bead. Smooth, weighty, marbled with dark green veins like river glass. A trade, a message. Not stay away, not welcome, but something older. Ridge stood there in the morning silence, sun warming his shoulders, the forest still watching. And for the first time in years, he felt the edges of his life shift. Like the boundaries he'd drawn to keep the world out might not hold anymore. Like something was asking him a question and waiting, very patiently, for an answer. The bead was still in his hand when Ridge noticed the boot print. Not his. This one was different. Standard military tread, deep heel, pressed sharp into the soft ridge of mud just beyond where the stone line had ended the day before, and laid right over it, over the giant print from yesterday, the one that hadn't belonged to any man. He stared down at it, jaw tightening. A size 11 boot stepping straight through the threshold of something sacred. No respect, no pause, just force. He didn't move at first. Just let the forest speak around him. What little of it was still willing to. The birds were back, but hesitant. The wind was a low whistle through the high trees, like something unsettled had been stirred loose. Ridge turned slowly and crouched beside the track. The edge of it had started to crumble slightly from dew, but the depth was fresh. Probably within the last 6 hours. Someone else had come, and they weren't alone. He followed the impressions down into the lower trails, where the roots curled like sleeping animals, and the ground dipped in soft places that held every careless step like a record. After maybe 30 yards, another print appeared, then a third, wider apart, spread like men fanning out in formation. Then came the first hint of metal, rusted teeth, a coil of tension spring, set into the base of a hollowed stump, almost artfully disguised beneath a scatter of broken pine needles. Ridge leaned closer, eyes narrowing. It was a trap, big, industrial, the kind meant to hold, not kill. But this one wasn't meant for deer. He spotted the second one 5 minutes later, deeper in, off a faint animal path. Then a third, this time wired with thin trip cord strung between 2 bushes at shin height. He almost didn't see the camera tucked in the stone hollow nearby, an old 35mm rig, the kind with flashbulb triggers and manual windback. Not a hunter's toy. Not tourist stuff either. This was field gear, rigged for still shots, timed and silent. He stepped around it like it might go off. Every instinct in him sharpened. Ridge wasn't military, but he'd spent long enough in hospitals, in senior care wards, watching for the signs that something precious was about to vanish. He recognized preparation when he saw it. And whoever had set this up wasn't waiting to photograph wildlife. They were hunting something they thought was real. He ducked low and moved slow. The terrain flattened out near a sandstone overhangs where the trees broke just enough to let light dapple through like poured amber. That's when he heard them. Voices, distant but clear. Male, sharp, clipped. The kind that didn't waste breath on small talk. If it's alive, we contain it. If not, scrap the haul. Silence. Then boots on gravel, a canteen cap twisting open. Ridge didn't move. He pressed his body against the slope, back to stone, and listened. He could feel the weight of the bead in his breast pocket, could still smell the faint iron tang of disturbed earth from the first trap. The men were just up the incline. Their camp wasn't large, but efficient. 1 tent, camouflage tarp slung between trees, field packs arranged like a triangle, and right in the center, a stake, short, clean, marked with survey tape and a circle of bright orange paint. They were planning to drive something into that ring. He eased away before he was seen, slid back down through the brush like wind. No broken sticks, no heavy steps, but something itched at the base of his spine. When he reached a narrow bend near the edge of the box canyon, he spotted it, just barely. A carved log, human-shaped, about the size of a child, wrapped in torn fabric, stained with something brownish red, set in the crook of 2 trees, like a dress rehearsal. It was too clean to be an accident, too still to be anything but deliberate. He stared at it, stomach tight. It wasn't about luring in an animal anymore. They were studying behavior, mimicking form, building something meant to test intelligence. He turned, sick rising behind his ribs, and started moving quicker. Not running. But there was a pressure now. The same kind you feel when you know the road behind you might not be clear next time. Halfway back toward the boundary stones, he noticed another trap. This one different. The fabric caught his eye first. A swatch of green nylon, frayed at the edge, stained, familiar. He bent down and touched it. Same material as his jacket, same shade. The blood on it was dry, but fresh enough. Not animal blood. No fur, no flesh. Just the stain. And beneath it, one of the traps had been reset. He understood then. They weren't just hunting what lived here. They were preparing for someone like him. A witness. A problem. They knew someone had entered their territory. And they'd made a replica of that person's scent. Their jacket, their blood. Not just to catch something, but to test it. To see how far it would go to help. To see if it would cross a line for someone who didn't belong. Ridge stepped back, every hair on his arms rising, his mouth dry, his palms damp. And then, out of nowhere, a memory bloomed behind his eyes, bright, cold, unwanted. The hallway in the hospital, fluorescent lights, nurses whispering behind a curtain. His mother curled small in a bed too white for comfort, IV lines taped to her arm. He'd asked what the status was, and the man in the white coat, smiling like it was normal, had called her a case. Not a person, a case to resolve, a burden to manage. That same tone lived in the voices he'd just heard in the woods. Clinical, detached, efficient. Not evil, worse than that. Indifferent. He walked faster now, breath shallow, pulse ticking in his ears. His boots hit the soil harder than he meant them to, but the trees didn't punish him for it. They seemed to open, as if nudging him along. He reached the ridge by twilight. The air was cooler, thinner. The sun tucked behind a shoulder of the mountain, casting long shadows across the clearing. He stepped past the last rise and saw it instantly. The stones were still there, but now, leading away from them, thin, wet, unmistakable, was a smear of dark blood. Not human. Too dark, too thick, and scattered, not poured. It dragged into the fog. Not toward him, but back into the woods. Something was hurt. Something had passed through here after him. And it hadn't left angry. It had left bleeding. He stood there, barely breathing, the bead still warm in his chest pocket. He didn't speak, didn't call out, just lowered himself slowly to one knee and touched the edge of the stone line. Then he whispered, barely above breath, "I saw it. I know what they're doing." The wind didn't answer, but the silence did. And somewhere, deep in the woods beyond, a single stone clicked against another, sharp, deliberate, hollow like a bell. He rose, and he knew. The forest had heard him, and now it was his turn to listen. The blood trail wasn't thick, but it was there, dark, slick, and already drying at the edges. It wound past the stone marker line like someone had poured a thread of ink into the forest. Ridge followed it in silence, heart steady, boot falls careful not to blur the path. The sun hadn't climbed yet. Mist clung low to the underbrush. Every breath felt colder than it should have been for mid-fall. He moved past the ridge lip and down into the lower channel where the runoff from last week's rain had cut fresh grooves into the dirt. The blood was still visible there, caught in little pockets of damp, dotting the way like a trail of bruises. It led toward the waterfall. He hadn't planned to go that far today. The terrain beyond the falls was steep, rarely dry. Old survey maps marked the drop-off and noted natural hazard, unstable shelf. In ink so faded you had to angle the page to even catch it. But the path now wasn't his to make. It had already been drawn. By the time he reached the edge of the pool, the air had shifted. Cooler, but not the chill of morning. Deeper, richer. There was a kind of breath behind the trees now, like the earth had exhaled from a secret mouth it rarely opened. The falls themselves weren't wide. Maybe 10 feet across, no more than a 20-foot drop. Water slid down the rock face in ribbons, not sheets, catching light where it could. But behind it, behind the veil of falling water, he saw it. Heat shimmer. Not steam, not fog. Heat. He stepped closer. The blood smears continued across the rocks, stopping right at the base of the water, then disappearing into the fall itself. His boots found traction across the slick stone as he hugged the left side, then eased behind the curtain. The change was instant. The roar of the water dulled to a thrum. The light softened, and the temperature rose. He stepped into a hollow of carved stone, natural, ancient, shaped by wind and time. And beyond it, at the back of the cavern, an opening. Not large, just enough for a man to crouch and move forward. He did. The tunnel curved right. The light dimmed again, but the warmth stayed, humming against his arms and face. Then the tunnel opened, and Ridge saw it. A valley, hidden, cut off from the outer forest by a ring of stone and trees that folded into themselves like a protective clasp. There was no snow here, no brittle leaves. just green, deep and warm and old. A pocket of life preserved like a secret the earth had decided not to share. The air smelled like moss and crushed bark and something sweeter, almost herbal. Ridge stood at the edge of the slope, eyes wide, heart thudding. Then he saw the structures. Not houses, not huts, just shapes. Large nests made of woven limbs and moss, nestled in pockets between trees. Some open, some partially covered by lean-to stone arrangements. On the far side, by a gentle slope of earth, stood something more defined, flat stones arranged in a circle, with a thick wooden bowl set in the center, half filled with water and what looked like roots, berries, leaves, not placed randomly. Arranged, he took 2 steps down, then stopped. Something moved. It wasn't sudden. No crack of limbs or grunt, just presence. From the base of the largest sleeping nest came a low shift. Then the shape unfolded slowly. Massive, injured, dragging one side slightly but still towering even in partial crouch. Hearth. Ridge knew it wasn't a name. It was just the only word that came to him when he saw the figure again, this time under daylight, in its own place. The creature's side was marked with dried blood, matted fur, and a gash that ran from rib to hip. The trap had bitten deep, too deep for something to walk far, but it had walked anyway. Ridge didn't reach for his pack, didn't move toward it. He did what he'd done the first time. He let silence speak first. Hearth watched him, eyes dark, aware. There was intelligence there, not just animal instinct. Calculation, memory. Then Ridge, slow and deliberate, reached into his chest pocket. The bead. The silver hair. He held them up again, not as an offering this time, as a reminder. I came with permission. Hearth blinked once. No snarl, no step forward, just breath. Ridge lowered his arm and looked to the side, where the gash cut across the creature's rib cage. It was angry, swollen, a dull shine of infection beginning to set in. He exhaled slowly, knees stiff as he moved into a crouch. He unhooked his pack, opened it without a word. One by one, he set out the things he'd brought, not just for survival, but for care. Clean cloth, gauze, a roll of bandage, a tin of salve, alcohol, a stitched pouch with his mother's needles and thread. He didn't expect to use them, but something in him had brought them anyway. Behind him a sound. He turned fast, breath caught. There, at the ridge wall above, another shape, smaller, leaner, upright. Sable, standing guard. The creature didn't descend, just watched, shoulders squared, ready, like a sentry carved into bark. Ridge kept his hands open. He pointed to the injured one, then back to the pack. Let me. He didn't know if it understood the motion. But Sable didn't move, didn't stop him either. He turned back, and for a long moment, Hearth didn't budge. Then, slow as glacier melt, it shifted. Not toward Ridge, but away. It knelt. Not fully, not all the way, just enough to allow access to the wound. The air inside Ridge tightened. He moved forward on his knees, hands steady, heart banging hard against his ribs. He took the cloth, poured water, cleaned the blood. The flesh underneath twitched but didn't flinch away. The gash was deep, more torn than cut. He recognized the edge. Trap metal, curved. Not the kind made for deer. The kind made to restrain a creature that could tear through trees. He worked slow, careful. He didn't speak, only breathed. When he reached for the needle, he paused, held it up, let Hearth see, then began. The skin was thick, not quite human, not animal either. Something between. Every stitch took strength, not finesse. The needle bent twice, but he kept going. Sable shifted once on the ridge. A sound, stone trickling, warning. But nothing approached. Not yet. He finished the last knot. Tied it tight. Pressed the gauze gently over the seal. Hearth exhaled. A sound like a furnace releasing pressure. Not pain, just relief. Then, without warning, it reached into a fold of the woven nest beside it. Lifted something. Ridge tensed, instinct flashing. But the hand opened, and inside, wrapped in old cloth, was an object. Small, rounded. He took it when offered, opened it slowly. A locket, tarnished, broken chain. Inside, half a photograph. The edge torn, but the smile still intact. A woman. Ridge froze. He knew that smile. It wasn't his mother, but it could have been. Someone had carried this here. Held it. Kept it. Not as trash, as memory. He looked back up. Hearth's eyes didn't move. But the gesture had been made. This is how we remember too. He set it down carefully. No questions. Only thanks. Then, slowly, the creature did something Ridge didn't expect. It lifted its massive hand, placed it over its chest, then reached forward and placed it over Ridge's, exactly where Ridge had once held the bead in hair, exactly where his heartbeat still thudded. It didn't stay long. Just a second, a touch. But Ridge felt it like fire, not pain. Oath! Then the hand pulled back, and the moment passed. He gathered his things. Not all. The extra cloth, the unused salve. He left them behind. Not payment, not charity, respect. When he turned to leave, Hearth didn't stop him. Sable was already gone. But as he reached the curtain of water again, he paused once more, looked back. The valley behind him shimmered in that strange warmth. And for the first time, Ridge didn't feel like a trespasser. He felt like someone who'd been seen. As he stepped through the falls, the light hit his eyes sharp. Day was breaking. The fog outside had started to lift. But as he stood blinking at the brightness, something froze him cold. Down by the edge of the pool, across the stones, stood a man. Not big, not moving, just waiting. Ridge's eyes adjusted. Dane Merrick. Boots wet, hands in his coat pockets. And in one hand, barely visible but clear, a sheet of paper. Ridge's paper, the hand-drawn sketch of the waterfall trail. Dane tilted his head, smiled, then turned and walked back into the trees. No words, just a quiet step back into the dark. By the time Ridge reached the edge of the tree line, the sky had dulled to a pale gray blue, washed out and brittle like something half-remembered. The waterfall was behind him now. So was the warmth of the hidden valley. The quiet there had felt different, layered, almost sacred. But out here, the world was colder again. Thinner, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. His boots carried a new weight, not just from the climb or the sweat cooling at his back, but from the image that hadn't left him since he passed through the veil of water. Dane Merrick, standing still with that folded paper in his hand, watching like he'd been there for hours. Ridge didn't speak a word on the trail down, didn't curse, didn't plan. He just moved. The cabin sat where it always had, tucked just behind the outer rise near Mabel Sutter's pasture land. It wasn't large, but it was his, at least enough to matter. The porch sagged in the left corner from last winter's weight, and the stovepipe needed sealing. But the bones were good. Solid pine, hand-cut. No one knew about it except Mabel, and she'd never ask questions he didn't offer answers to. He rounded the fence post by the horse paddock and stopped. Someone was curled near the barn wall. Small, still, arms wrapped around knees, a pack beside her like a half-deflated shield. Ridge didn't call out. He just approached slow, boots pressing soft against the frost-worn dirt, until he was close enough to catch the shallow rise and fall of breath. Then he knelt. The girl stirred when his shadow crossed her face, startled at first, then defensive, then resigned. Kara Halstead, 16, maybe 17 now. Eyes that had seen too much, but still hadn't learned how to look away. Her voice was cracked when she finally spoke. Didn't mean to scare the horse. You didn't. I just needed somewhere flat for the night. Didn't think anyone would be back till morning. He didn't ask why she was here. Didn't need to. But his gaze dropped briefly to her wrist. Thin, bruised, with a fresh line of angry red where something thin and sharp had once bitten in. Wire! Maybe fishing line. Maybe worse. He stood, walked to the cabin, unlatched the door, waited. Kara followed a few beats later. Inside, the air held the faint scent of wood smoke and cedar oil. The stove still radiated heat from the morning fire. Ridge pulled 2 chipped mugs from the shelf, poured water into the kettle, and set it to boil. She sat without being told. Didn't thank him. Didn't need to. Mabel showed up a half-hour later. She didn't knock. She never did. Just pushed the screen door open with one hand and carried in a tin of cornbread with the other. She took one look at Kara and didn't blink. Set the tin down, removed her gloves, pointed to the kettle. "Needs more ginger," she muttered. Then, like clockwork, she pulled out a tin box, metal, dented, older than Kara was, and laid it on the table. Inside, bandages, thread, iodine, cloth. Not sterile, not hospital grade, but real. The kind of care people still remembered how to give when no one was watching. Ridge stepped back, letting the old woman do her work. Kara didn't flinch, just winced once as the cloth hit raw skin. "They weren't just hunting deer," she said after a while. Ridge didn't respond. "I heard 'em talking about something bigger, smarter. One of them had a map." Mabel shot Ridge a glance. Not sharp, but knowing. Kara sipped the tea, then leaned forward. "I grabbed this from their gear before they noticed." She slid a notebook from her pack. The cover was soft leather, cracked at the corners. She opened it to a page marked with smudged fingerprints and ink-stained corners. It was hand-drawn, detailed, lines of elevation, old ranger routes, and toward the bottom, a sequence of notations Ridge recognized immediately. His notations. Copied, or worse, stolen. Ridge's heart went tight. He flipped through the next few pages. Coordinates, elevation, dated symbols, box canyon, stream marker, even a faint sketch of the waterfall bend. Someone had been following him long enough to reverse engineer his own paths. "How long were you near their camp?" he asked. Kara shrugged. "Long enough." She didn't elaborate, didn't have to. He recognized the language of girls who'd run from something more dangerous than wilderness. Mabel returned to the stove, poured more tea. Her hands moved slower now, joints thick with age, but nothing about her presence had softened. "They're getting careless," she said. "They're getting confident," Ridge replied. Later, when the light began to fade and the woods outside grew dark at the edges, the front door rattled. 3 knocks, firm, not hurried. Deputy Lila Crow stood in the threshold, wind in her jacket, tired in the eyes. She looked from Ridge to Kara, then to Mabel. "I got a report," she said, stepping in. "Old campfire up near Rattlesnake Hollow. 4 traps, no tags, steel jaws, commercial grade." "Anyone around?" Ridge asked. "No, but they were fresh, and they left a lure. Fake blood on fabric." She paused. "Green nylon." Kara's gaze dropped. Ridge didn't speak. "I saw your truck up near Split Ridge," Lila continued, turning to him. "You were up there alone?" He nodded. "You always hike that late?" "I don't like sharing the mountain." She studied him for a long beat, then leaned in slightly, voice low. "Be careful where you put your boots. You're not the only one on these trails anymore." Ridge met her eyes. "I never was." Lila stepped back. "You see anything that doesn't belong, call it in." He didn't agree. Didn't disagree. She left without saying more. The silence after she closed the door felt different. Not heavy, just edged. Kara rubbed her wrist absently, then looked to Ridge. "They called you something." He turned to her. She held his gaze. "They said you were the keeper." Something moved behind Ridge's expression. Not alarm, not confusion. Recognition. It wasn't a title. It was a tactic. They'd been watching. Longer than he thought. Mabel stood and walked to the cupboard. Pulled down a tin box with a sewing kit, a spool of gauze, and a bottle of antiseptic. She placed it in Ridge's hands, along with a glass bottle of grain alcohol and a roll of canvas wrap. "No one's coming to save that creature," she said. "No one's coming to save you either." She pressed her hand to Ridge's arm. "You already decided. Just don't waste time pretending you haven't." That night, after the fire burned low and Kara fell asleep, curled in the quilt Mabel left behind, Ridge stepped out onto the porch. The moon was thin, barely a whisper of silver. Cold drifted up from the fields, brittle and dry, And sitting there, on the porch rail, just to the left of the old tin lantern, was a flat stone, dark, smooth, fresh claw marks sliced across its surface. Not deep, just enough to be a direction. Not a warning, a summons. North, back toward the ridge, toward the silence. Ridge didn't pick it up, didn't move it. He just stood there, boots solid on the wood, breath fogging in the still air, and listened. Somewhere out there, the mountain was waiting, and he knew now. So was everything he'd tried not to become. The cold had teeth that night. Ridge felt it as he crossed the creek's edge beneath the black sky, the ice threading beneath each footstep like a second skin trying to grab hold. Every tree in the upper grove leaned with the weight of coming snow, though it hadn't yet fallen. It was early winter, mean in its waiting. The wind didn't howl. It whispered just enough to let you know you weren't alone. He moved fast, but not reckless. The ridgeline curved toward the same entry path he'd used before, the one tucked behind the drop where the stream split into two smaller fingers. But tonight, the route demanded more. The hunters were deeper now, bolder, and they were laying down traps like men who'd done this before. Men who knew what they were after wasn't just hiding, but thinking. At the far edge of the slope, he paused and lowered himself onto his belly, crawling forward through the brush until the trees thinned out just enough to catch sight of their new camp. It had grown. There were 3 tents now, all low profile. Camo netting pulled over the tops. The fire ring was cold, but still held a ring of fresh ash. At the center, a motionless pole had been driven deep into the ground. Metal, not wood, with a swivel on top and 2 thick straps hanging from either side. Not for tying down gear, for binding something upright. He watched from a ridge hollow, heart ticking like a second hand. Then he saw Dane. The man stood half-lit by a portable lamp, leaning over a crude workbench they'd built from stacked logs. His hands were bare despite the cold, moving with quiet precision as he adjusted the trigger mechanism on what looked like another tripwire rig. Camera, wire, light source, all in one box. Beside him, slumped on a stump, was another man Ridge hadn't seen before. Young, unshaven. Laughing quietly at something neither of them had said aloud. Ridge studied their layout. Every pathway was covered. Tripcord here, bell line there. Even one section lined with broken glass beneath a scatter of pine straw. Primitive, but brutal. They weren't just tracking movement anymore. They were controlling options. Herding. He circled low and found the main path in. The waterfall was less than 300 yards behind them, shielded by a narrow finger of boulders that would echo any sound twice before releasing it into the open. They had set their trap too close. He ducked down beneath a split log, checked his left, then moved. He unspooled a section of wire cutters from the strap across his chest, dropped into the crawl space beneath the northern net, and started his work. One cord, then another. He didn't cut them, just loosened the tension, moved the stones slightly, shifted the trigger angle. The camera on the west trail, he didn't destroy it. He flipped the orientation upward. It would now take shots of sky and treetops, not movement on the path. Every change subtle, undetectable unless someone triggered it. Every adjustment aimed not at sabotage, but confusion. Then he found the worst of it. Near the side of the camp, just beyond the lean-to with the lantern hook, was a cage. Not full-sized, meant to transport, not store. And inside it, bolted to the back wall, was a harness. Not designed for an animal. It was articulated. For arms. For shoulders. For a chest wide enough to hold a creature upright. They weren't trying to trap a legend. They were trying to abduct a being. The flash of anger burned through Ridge so fast he had to stop moving. He crouched low, hands planted into the cold dirt, letting the mountain remind him what mattered. Letting the silence wash back in. He didn't want to react. He wanted to remember. Because this wasn't about just stopping them. It was about not becoming them. He turned back toward the ridge, but heard the stone first. A small slip, loose rock, sharp enough to catch. He turned, slow. Kara, barely visible in the dark, crouched low near the tree line. her breath a faint cloud in the air, her face pale, eyes wide with guilt and fear. She'd followed him. Ridge didn't shout, didn't scold. He stepped back toward her, pressed a finger to his lips, and motioned down. She nodded, crouching tighter. They moved together now, slowly, side by side, through the outer trails. Ridge guided her through the dark with nothing but gesture and glance, slipping past every trip line, every false path. They reached the mouth of the waterfall trail. Ridge stopped her with a hand on her shoulder. "If you breathe too loud, they'll hear," he whispered low, almost just mouthing it. Kara nodded. Then she whispered back, voice shaking. "One of them had your paper." He looked at her. "The map," she said. "The one you said you lost." He closed his eyes for half a second. That's how they'd found the falls. The sketch he thought he'd dropped or misplaced had been stolen. Maybe even during the break-in at the truck. He hadn't noticed then because only one page was gone. He'd chalked it up to weather, to wind. They'd used him, and they were still using him. He moved faster now, Kara behind him, silent as the snow that had started to fall in thin, lazy drifts. The falls shimmered ahead, moonlight flashing on the cascade. He rounded the bend and felt his chest tighten. The nest was empty. Hearth was gone. The ground was wet with disturbed leaves. The woven grass mat where the creature had rested was overturned. A broken stone bowl lay shattered at the far side. But no blood, no drag marks, only footprints, huge, deep, moving away from the center, and a faint trace. New blood, not pooled, just streaked. A line down the side wall, vanishing into the narrow cleft where the secondary stream split from the fall and bent inward toward the cliffside. A passage Ridge hadn't explored. He stepped toward it, but Kara grabbed his sleeve. "You can't leave me here." Her voice cracked, but not from fear. From certainty. She knew what was coming. She wanted in, and he understood the weight of that choice. But not yet. "You wait here 5 minutes," he said. "No more." He handed her the flashlight from his belt, flipped it to red beam. "If you hear anything, don't run. Go back. Quiet." She didn't agree, but she didn't argue. He slipped through the side path, the water colder now, the stone walls pressing in. The passage narrowed, then opened suddenly into a small cavern, half-domed, walls slick with moss. And there, at the center, was Hearth. The creature was on one knee, breathing hard, clutching its side. The stitches had torn. Not all, but enough. The infection was spreading. A single bead of sweat, no, not sweat, something darker, dripped from its jaw. And beside it, silent, unmoving, was Sable, the younger one. Not hurt, not asleep, waiting, watching him. Ridge stepped forward slowly, dropped his pack, opened it. The tools were all there. What Mabel gave him. What he hadn't used last time. He worked fast. More alcohol. Cleaner needle. He didn't speak. Didn't blink when Sable moved to his side. Didn't flinch when Hearth opened one eye and rested a hand against his shoulder. Not to stop him, but to steady him. He sewed in silence. He worked like a man building something meant to last. Not just a stitch, not just a seal. A trust. A bridge. And when he finished, Hearth exhaled again. Just like before. But this time his hand dropped something into Ridge's palm. It was warm, and it wasn't stone. It was a locket. The same one as before, but the photo had changed. The other half was there. Reunited. Whole. Not by Ridge's doing, by theirs. Sable had kept it, carried it, and now returned it complete. Then Ridge heard it. The snap of brush. Far above, a silhouette at the edge of the ledge. Boots. Watching. Dane. Holding something that shimmered in the moonlight. A page. The page. And he turned once again and vanished into the dark. The cold had shifted from something you could brace against to something that entered you quietly. Ridge felt it under his skin, a hollow throb in his hands as he moved through the narrow passage again, deeper than before, into a part of the mountain he hadn't dared study too closely. Not until now. The light outside was already failing, but in here, Inside the ribs of stone, time had no edges. It pressed in around him like a closed mouth. Still, breathing. The wind hadn't followed him. It stayed outside the narrow gap in the rock, where snow piled up against the base of the cliff in silent warning. The rest of the world had hushed, but one sound still followed. The faint, uneven rush of breath ahead. Not his. Deeper inside, the cavern pulsed with warmth again. A breath from some hidden root or mineral pocket that held the valley's heat like a lung. He could feel it already on his face. Not comfort, not now. Just the presence of something alive. Sable stood at the mouth of the chamber, still, unmoving, a statue in the shadows. Her shoulders were drawn tight, one hand resting on the ridge wall where moss had grown thick and dark. She didn't step forward. She didn't snarl. But her head tilted, and her eyes narrowed just enough to say one thing. Caution. At her feet lay a pile of loose stones. She dipped one hand and swept them down the sloped edge of the corridor wall, fingers parting like water. The rattle echoed, sharp, fast, deliberate. A warning. Ridge slowed, raised both palms. Let her see the bag on his shoulder. Let her see how he lowered it gently to the dirt without reaching for anything inside. She didn't stop him, but she didn't move aside either. So he waited. The breathing ahead grew heavier. He stepped carefully around her, one slow pace at a time, and moved past the curve of the chamber wall where the glow returned, gold and amber and low, like the inside of a hearth on a night with no power and no one left to light candles. And there he was. Hearth, collapsed against the far slope, one massive arm across his middle, the other hand pressing low to his thigh where the blood had soaked deeper now. Not dripping, but heavy, slow. Ridge saw the bruising, saw how far the blackness had spread beneath the skin. The trap wound had reopened, not from neglect, from movement. The stitches had torn wide again, and Ridge could already tell it wasn't just surface damage anymore. Something had sunk in deeper, metal, rust, whatever the trap had carried with it. He didn't need a microscope to know what that meant. The flesh was hot around the wound. The skin had gone tight. Infection was already working its way up the leg like a silent fuse. He moved fast, laid out the tools one by one. The tin vial of alcohol Mabel had handed him without speaking. The new thread, thicker needle, gauze strips soaked in pine tar and salt. And then, finally, the old glass ampule of antibiotics Tessa Vaughn had slipped into his hand 2 weeks ago when she told him, "I'm not asking what it's for. Just don't waste it on something that doesn't fight back." He drew the syringe, slow, careful not to rattle it. Hearth watched him, didn't flinch, didn't growl. But his body trembled beneath the effort of staying upright. The needle slid in at the shoulder. A slow push, a long exhale. Ridge whispered nothing, just placed his hand over Hearth's forearm, firm, steady. Not comfort, just presence. The kind of presence a man learns when he's sat too long beside someone slipping away and doesn't know how to hold them in this world anymore. You don't say anything, you just stay. He poured alcohol down the wound. Hearth tensed, muscles locking, but he didn't strike. He didn't move. Sable hadn't stepped into the light yet, but Ridge could feel her weight behind him, the way the cavern seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the wrong motion. He worked fast. The metal fragment came out clean. A curved hook, not sharp, but barbed in the way old traps were. Made not to kill quickly, but to hold. He dropped it into a tin cup and let it clatter. He sewed again, this time with a tighter stitch. Crisscrossed, pulled hard. The wound wouldn't close perfect, but it would hold. The second vial of antibiotics went into the muscle. Hearth's shoulders sagged, the breath deepening, still alert, still watching, but less fight now, more trust. Ridge sat back against the opposite wall, his hands shaking a little. Not from fear, from the thing that comes after fear, when your body starts realizing what it just did. And then Hearth moved, not toward him, not to flee. He reached to the bundle at his side, lifted it with care, unwrapping it like something sacred. And there it was, a photograph. No frame, no glass, just the paper. Two people, blurred, smiling, edges torn with age. It wasn't Ridge's photo, but the expression was familiar. The same kind of memory you don't carry in your pocket. You carry in your ribs. Harth held it up, then gently set it between them. An offering. Ridge nodded, not as thanks, but as understanding. Then Harth reached farther into the bundle. Pulled something else. A worn strip of fabric, blue and white, faded. A ranger patch, old, older than Ridge expected. But it wasn't just the patch. It was the motion that followed. Harth placed his hand over his chest again, flat, deliberate, then reached forward and placed it gently against Ridge's. Same spot, same pressure. And for the first time, it wasn't just a mimic. It was a mark, a recognition, not of who Ridge was, but who he had become. Sable stepped forward then, silent, close now. She held something in her hand, a stone, small, polished, marked with a single line down the center. She placed it beside the torn patch, then looked Ridge in the eye. No aggression, no command, just meaning. This is your place now too. He didn't speak, didn't reach for either item, just nodded once and sat there with them. Inside the heat of the mountain, the smell of pine and moss and blood mingling in the quiet like smoke from a long burning fire. Time passed in folds. No clocks, no hours, just heartbeats. When Ridge finally stood, his knees cracked, legs stiff. His breath fogged again as the chamber cooled with a shift in the earth's breath. He packed the tools, left behind the rest. Cloth, bandage, salve, the things that mattered more in a place like this than they ever could in a town that didn't know what to name the things it feared. He nodded once to Harth, turned, walked past Sable, who didn't stop him. And then he stepped out into the dark corridor again, where the cold returned with teeth sharper than before. Snow was falling harder now, fat flakes. Fast, he reached the outer mouth of the falls, could hear the water ahead, could see the faint silver line of moonlight trying to break through the storm clouds above. And then he stopped. Dane Merrick was waiting, standing at the edge of the pool. No weapon in hand, no torch, just a steady stance. One boot dipped in the shallow creek, one page curled in his fingers. The map, the sketch Ridge had drawn weeks ago. Dane lifted it once, then let it fall to the water. Ridge didn't speak. Dane smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. And then he turned and walked back into the trees. Not fast, not afraid, just like a man who had already planned what came next. Ridge watched the map page sink, caught briefly on a rock, then swallowed whole by the current. He didn't chase him, didn't call out. The forest would deal with men like that. The mountain had its own way of remembering who stepped where, and who didn't ask. Snow had stopped falling by morning, but the cold stayed behind like a second skin. Ridge stood near the pasture fence behind Mabel's old barn, hands deep in his coat pockets, boots frozen into the same muddy patch he'd been rooted to since just after sunrise. The frost hadn't melted. The sky looked brittle, and in his chest, something pressed outward, tight, hard, asking for release without telling him what shape it needed to take. The world didn't wait. It moved on with or without your clarity. He turned when he heard Kara step off the porch. Her coat swallowed her frame, sleeves bunched near the wrists. The girl didn't say anything. She just handed him a metal thermos she'd borrowed from Mabel's cupboard and looked up like she wanted to ask the question both of them already knew the answer to. "They're moving toward the ridge," she said. Ridge nodded. "You think they know where the valley is?" He didn't answer. Kara shifted her weight. "If I told Lila everything I've seen, everything you've done, they'd come with trucks, helicopters, they'd call in state units." "They wouldn't believe you," Ridge said quietly. "And if they did, it'd be worse." Silence stretched long between them. She didn't argue. She just looked at him like she was trying to understand how a man could carry that much weight and not go under. Ridge didn't tell her he already had, that every day he woke up was just another effort not to stay down. Behind them, the back door creaked open. Mabel stepped out holding a tin box. She wore a heavy quilted jacket and a wool scarf knotted tight around her neck. The box had seen better years. One of its corners was dented, paint worn down to bare metal. She handed it to Ridge without a word. Inside were more supplies: alcohol, clean gauze, a second pair of gloves, a tin of ointment sealed with wax. There was no speech, no request, just the shared understanding of old people and men who listen better with their hands than their mouths. Mabel gave a short nod, then turned and walked back inside, the door closing like a soft punctuation mark. Later that day, Kara brought the notebook, the one she'd stolen from Dane's camp. The pages were shaking in her hand. She had circled a set of coordinates on the back page, cross-referenced them with Ridge's earlier maps, the lines he'd hand-drawn from memory of the Box Canyon. The path Dane had taken was a funnel, narrowing toward the High Ridge Trail near the second ravine, the only one with acoustic bounce strong enough to mimic movement from two directions. Ridge stared at the ink for a long while. They weren't trying to find the valley. They were trying to trap its protectors, drive them out, force them into visibility. And Ridge was the thread that connected them all. Tessa showed up just before dusk. She wore her old denim jacket, patched at the elbows, and had brought 2 more syringes of antibiotics and a steel thermos of hot broth. When she handed them over, she didn't ask where they were going. She just looked at Ridge like she was seeing through him. "You're not patching a wound anymore," she said softly. "You're shielding a family." That night they heard the gunfire. Not aimed, not rapid, just 2 shots, measured. Sounded like warnings, but Ridge knew better. They weren't warning anyone. They were testing to see who would flinch. By dawn, Ridge had packed everything he could carry. Kara sat beside the front door, not offering to go, not asking to stay. She reached into her jacket and pulled something from the inner pocket, a slip of folded paper, the same one Dane had written on, copied from Ridge's stolen sketch. "I replaced one of the coordinate lines," she said. "Swap 2 digits. Ridge looked at her. "If they follow this version, they'll walk right past the ridge line." He unfolded the page. The ink was fresh. One corner smudged where her thumb had pressed too long. "But I left it in his tent, like I was in a hurry." She looked up at him with the kind of guilt that doesn't come from doing wrong. It comes from knowing someone's about to pay for your deception. "He'll know someone tampered with it," Ridge said. "I know." He folded the map, slid it into his jacket. "You did good," he said, "but now you stay out of it." "I'm not a kid." "You're not a soldier either." She didn't reply, but he knew he'd already lost the argument. By noon, the trap was sprung. It started at Mabel's. Ridge returned to the paddock to find the gate broken open. One of the horses gone, scratch marks on the inside of the post. Kara stood near the porch, shaking, her fists clenched so hard her knuckles were bone white. "They came here?" "Last night," she said. "Didn't knock. Just looked around. Said they were looking for you. I said you left. They didn't believe me." Ridge took a step toward her. "Kara!" "I told them nothing," she snapped. But they still knew where to look. Ridge scanned the trees. Snow had crusted in uneven patches, but one line of prints was fresh. Heading north. Not booted, but human. And small. Kara had followed again, this time too far. Lila showed up just after sundown. She parked crooked near the end of the dirt road, boots crunching ice as she walked. Held something in her hands, a steel-jawed trap. Closed, but stained. She dropped it on the porch. "They're not even hiding it now." Ridge stared at the thing like it had a pulse. "Found it just south of Ridge Hollow," Lila said. "Trail goes cold near the high bend." She glanced at him. "I also found drag marks." "No blood?" "No," she said. "But someone bled there. Not much. Just enough to tell me it wasn't a deer." He didn't ask if she'd seen Kara's boot prints. She didn't ask if he knew more than he was telling. Some things between them had moved past questions. Ridge turned and walked inside, poured water from the tin basin, splashed his face once, then went to the drawer. Pulled out the one thing he hadn't touched since all this started, a folded map of the entire northern expanse. Not the one he used in the field, the one he drew for himself. Private, quiet, the map of places you only go to if you've been invited. He laid it flat on the table, marked every ridge, every runoff trail, and finally drew one final line through it all. A decoy, a second Box Canyon, similar acoustics. False terrain, a trap for the trappers. He folded it and slid it into the outer pocket of his jacket. Tessa was right. He wasn't just patching wounds. He wasn't just watching anymore. He was choosing, and that made him something else now. That made him a keeper. The snow had begun to melt in strings, trailing down the trunks like veins of cold surrender. Early summer in the high woods still bit like a warning, but the worst had passed. Ridge moved quietly up the west face of the canyon, his boots soft in the wet mulch, coat damp where his shoulder had brushed too close to the underbrush. The light was low but steady, pale yellow and silver, the kind of sun that only comes after a storm has wrung everything dry. He didn't speak. The trail ahead curved hard right, then narrowed between two outcrops of stone where the sound of your own heartbeat always came back to you louder than it should. Ridge had used it once before, years ago, to drive off coyotes with an old stovepipe and a hammer. But today, it wasn't sound he needed. It was silence. Real, deliberate, human silence. Behind him, a second pair of boots. Lila Crow moved light, steady, eyes scanning the brush like she'd grown up listening to wind instead of people. She didn't ask why he brought her. She'd seen enough now, traps, scars, altered maps, to know this wasn't about filing reports anymore. It was about bearing witness. And if Ridge's plan worked, she'd be the last person alive who knew what hadn't been written down. The fake map was folded in her inner pocket. Ridge had burned his copy the night before. They reached the first bluff just before the sun crested the southern peak. Ridge slowed, raising a hand. Below them, in the false canyon Dane had been led to, the shadows held still. A shape moved, then another. The hunters had arrived. Not loud, not careless. These were men who didn't laugh, didn't brag. They set snares like surgeons, spoke in short signals, eyes always working. Ridge counted 3 at first, then a 4th, further west, dragging something that looked like an acoustic dish in a sling pack. He knew what that meant. Sound redirection. They were planning to flush something out with artificial echoes, make it think it was being surrounded. But this canyon, this one echoed back wrong. It warped sound, doubled it, turned a whisper into a shriek. Ridge had marked it years ago with a quiet X on his real map and never spoken of it again. He turned to Lila. Her jaw was tight, but she didn't flinch. She pulled the lens from her chest pocket and snapped the shutter. 1 frame, 2. Clear evidence. Baited traps. Men moving without tags or permits. Enough for a federal charge. But they both knew that wasn't what this was really about. Back at the trailhead, Kara waited with Mabel. Ridge had refused to let her come. Not this time. Not with men like Dane out there. Not when this could go sideways in the space of a breath. He and Lila moved down the bluff, quiet, guided by breath and old instinct. They followed the slope into the mouth of the canyon, where the air funneled fast, compressing their sound. Ridge could feel it already, the mountain's voice building like something beneath the skin. The men below didn't hear it. Not yet. They were busy setting the last of their snares, wide steel-jaw traps mounted to timber stakes. One of them stepped back, kicked a stone. It rolled once, then again, and the whole western face answered. A long groaning crack. Not a cave-in, not yet, but the kind of warning sound that only ever comes once. Dane stood at the center of the group, arms crossed, a scoped rifle slung low on his hip. He turned his head slowly, scanning the ledges. Ridge didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, without signal, the forest changed. Not wind, not storm, a presence. The air thickened, pressed inward like hands on either side of your ribs. Ridge looked up the northern ridge and saw them. 2 figures, tall, still. Hearth stood like a stone rooted to the ridge crest. Sable was behind him, half hidden, muscles drawn tight as wire. They didn't make sound. They didn't need to. The men below hadn't seen them yet, but they would. Ridge felt his pulse beat faster. Then Lila whispered, "They're going to walk straight into that upper snare." She was right. The lead hunter, burly, short beard, gray vest. had moved to the edge of a ridge hollow, where the tripwire strung low. It was hidden beneath pine needles, rigged to swing a second trap down from above. A deadfall, metal spikes embedded in a net of iron rebar. Ridge didn't think. He stepped into the open. No further. His voice didn't echo. The men turned as one. Dane's face didn't move. Only his hand did, slowly dropping to the rifle strap. "Step away," Ridge said again. Lila moved beside him, badge drawn. "Drop the weapons. You're in violation of 24 federal statutes." The younger man, probably no older than 25, glanced at Dane. Dane didn't blink. He lifted his rifle, not in a draw, just enough to make his meaning clear. But then it began, a low rumble, like thunder from the inside out. Stones fell from the upper ridge. A shape blurred through the trees to the left, sable, moving like lightning, fast and deliberate, cutting the men off without striking. The hunters froze. Hearth stepped forward, slow, deliberate, and this time everyone saw. No hiding, no shadows. He stood on two legs, full height rising above the slope like a monument, fur ragged near his ribs, one hand still marked where Ridge had stitched him. The young man stepped back hard, eyes wide. "It's—" he started, but couldn't finish. Dane turned, leveled the rifle. Sable growled once, low, thunderous. The forest shifted again, stones rolled. Ridge felt it before he heard it. The sound, the click. From above, the trap Dane had set, triggered by his own men. A net dropped. Not on Hearth. Not on Sable. On Dane. He fired once. The bullet missed everything. Struck stone. Echoed. Then the net dropped fully. Snapped him off his feet. Steel clanged. Wind sucked out of him. Hearth didn't move. Just watched. 1 foot forward. Not to kill. Just to look. To see what a man would do with power stolen. Dane didn't reach for his gun again. He just lay there, breathing. Ridge walked forward, hands out. Lila was already collecting the weapons. The others had dropped theirs. It was over. Not with a fight, but with a choice. Hearth turned, left Dane in the net. No retaliation, no strike. Just the sound of heavy footfalls vanishing into trees that chose who they allowed to follow. Lila cuffed Dane herself. Miranda Wright spoken in a voice steadier than the mountain. The others walked without argument. A convoy of silence. By dusk, the mountain was quiet again. Ridge walked the old path back toward the cabin. Kara was waiting, eyes bright. He didn't speak, just looked at her and nodded once. Later that week, Lila filed the report. Illegal traps, federal violations, animal endangerment. All true. No mention of anything else. No mention of Hearth. No mention of the mile-wide silence around Ridge's cabin that no predator ever crossed again. No one asked, and no one told. That summer, Ridge kept walking the same trails, map in hand, lines redrawn, paths noted. A new mark circled around his land, 1 mile out in every direction. Nothing crossed it. No bear, no coyote, no stranger. The forest had remembered, and it was returning the favor. Then, one night, late July, just after the sun slipped behind the hill and the crickets had started their song, Ridge stepped onto the porch. On the step sat a single stone bead. New, not like the one from before. This one was darker, veined in blue. He picked it up, felt the weight. It wasn't a thank you. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a message. The map isn't finished yet. Sometimes the quietest places hold the loudest truths. Not the kind you can prove in a courtroom, not the kind you can fit inside a photograph, but the kind that live deep in the bones of a place, in the breath between trees, and the hush that follows when something ancient decides to trust you. There are stories not meant to be shouted, only carried. Whispers passed down not in books, but in how gently we walk the earth, in how we treat what we don't understand, in how we choose to protect, even when no one's watching. This story was never about monsters or myths. It was about choices. The kind that don't win you awards. The kind that don't make headlines, but the kind that matter. We live in a world quick to label, quick to chase, to capture, to prove. But there is a different kind of strength in restraint. A rare kind of power in keeping quiet when the world demands spectacle. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is leave something untouched. And maybe that's the lesson that hides behind every shadow in the woods, beneath every stone carefully laid. That compassion doesn't always roar. Sometimes it knocks softly, waits patiently, and walks away when it knows it must. What we guard, what we choose to protect, says everything about who we are, not just as individuals, but as a people. So wherever you are tonight, whether you believe in what can't be seen or simply hold space for what might still be possible, I hope this story leaves you with more than just questions. I hope it leaves you with a feeling of stillness, of wonder, of what it means to be kind when no one is keeping score. Because maybe, just maybe, some things were never meant to be caught, only kept. Thank you for spending your time here. If this story stayed with you in any way, we'd love to hear what you felt. Drop us a comment, share your thoughts, your questions, or just one word that lingers with you. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe and follow this channel. There are more stories waiting to be told. Stories that speak in silence. We hope to see you again. Until then, walk gently and listen deeply.